a simple grandmother mocked on stage, until her voice wins a standing ovation. Margaret Wilson wiped the flour from her weathered hands as she heard the television in the living room of her modest Cleveland home. At 72, her daily routine revolved around baking pies for the local diner and caring for her small garden behind the house. The autumn wind rattled the windows of the 1950s ranch-style home she had shared with her late husband for 47 years. Orange and yellow leaves danced across her front yard, reminding her of the countless seasons she had watched pass from this same kitchen window. Her granddaughter Jessica sat on the worn couch, watching a talent competition show on the old television set Harold had refused to replace for years. The familiar sounds of her neighborhood drifted through the walls, children playing after school, the distant hum of traffic on Interstate 90, and Mrs. Patterson's dog barking at the mailman like clockwork. The scent of cinnamon and nutmeg filled the air from her latest batch of apple turnovers, a recipe passed down from her own grandmother in rural Kentucky. "Grandma, you should totally audition for this," Jessica laughed, pointing at the screen where a young singer was receiving praise from celebrity judges. "You have the most beautiful voice I've ever heard." Margaret chuckled softly, her gray hair pulled back in a simple bun, secured with the same bobby pins she had used for decades. She had sung in the church choir for decades, her voice carrying hymns through Sunday services and funeral ceremonies, but never imagined performing beyond those familiar wooden pews. The smell of apple pie filling the kitchen reminded her of the countless church bake sales, where her desserts always sold first, bringing the community together with simple pleasures. Her arthritis-worn fingers traced the edge of the kitchen counter, where Harold used to sit every morning with his coffee, reading her the weather forecast and local news. "Oh, sweetie, that's for young people with dreams," she replied, stirring a pot of vegetable soup that filled the kitchen with warmth. But Jessica's words lingered in her mind as she watched contestants half her age take the stage, with confidence she had never possessed. That evening, as she sat in her late husband's favorite armchair, Margaret found herself humming the hymns that had comforted her through life's storms. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, marking another quiet evening in a life that had become predictably peaceful, yet somehow incomplete. The idea seemed impossible, yet something deep inside her stirred with a longing she hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was time to honor the gift her husband always said she possessed. The next morning, Margaret stood before her bathroom mirror, studying the reflection of a woman who had lived through decades of joy and sorrow. Deep lines around her eyes told stories of laughter shared with Harold and tears shed during his final months in the Cleveland Clinic. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the phone to call the show's audition hotline, the number she had secretly written on a scrap of paper the night before. "I must be losing my mind," she whispered to herself, but dialed anyway, her heart racing with each ring. The young receptionist on the other end seemed surprised by her age, but scheduled an appointment for the following week in Chicago. Margaret spent the next few days practicing in her kitchen, her voice echoing off the yellow wallpaper she and Harold had hung 20 years ago during a weekend home improvement project. She remembered how he had stood on the ladder, carefully smoothing each strip while she hummed below, their teamwork perfected through decades of marriage. The kitchen had become her sanctuary, where she felt closest to Harold's memory and most comfortable expressing herself through song. Jessica visited daily after her shift at the local bank, offering encouragement and helping her grandmother choose a simple blue dress for the audition. "Grandma, you've sung at every wedding, funeral, and baptism in this neighborhood. People have been moved to tears by your voice," Jessica reminded her, holding up the dress against Margaret's small frame. The dress still fit perfectly, a testament to her careful eating habits and daily walks around the neighborhood. Margaret's neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, stopped by with fresh chocolate chip cookies and shared her own doubts about the venture. "At our age, dear, isn't it better to stay comfortable?" she asked gently, settling into Harold's old chair with a concerned expression. "We've earned our peace." Her words carried the weight of a generation that had learned to accept limitations rather than challenge them. But Margaret had made up her mind after finding Harold's old journal, where he had written about her beautiful voice, and his regret that she never shared it with the world. The pages were yellowed with age, but his words remained clear and full of love for the woman who had filled their home with music for nearly 5 decades. She had spent decades caring for others, and now it was time to honor the part of herself she had kept quiet for too long. The drive to Chicago would be her first real adventure in years, and her first time leaving Ohio since Harold's funeral 3 years ago. The Chicago theater buzzed with energy as hundreds of hopeful contestants lined up outside in the crisp October air. Margaret felt out of place among the young performers with their flashy outfits, professional headshots, and confident attitudes. She clutched her simple black purse and wore the same blue dress she had chosen for church services, her small suitcase containing only essentials for the overnight trip. The city's skyline towered above them, making her feel even smaller than usual as car horns honked and sirens wailed in the distance. Other contestants glanced at her with puzzled expressions, some whispering among themselves about the elderly woman who had somehow gotten into the wrong line. "Is she lost?" she heard a teenage girl ask her friend, both dressed in sparkling performance outfits that cost more than Margaret's monthly grocery budget. A young man with spiked hair and leather jacket looked her up and down dismissively, his arms crossed as he sized up the competition. "This isn't bingo night, Grandma," he muttered loud enough for others to hear, earning chuckles from nearby contestants. Margaret's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she remembered Jessica's words of encouragement and Harold's belief in her gift. The autumn wind whipped through the urban canyon of buildings, carrying the scents of street vendors and exhaust fumes, so different from her quiet Cleveland neighborhood. She thought of her morning walks past familiar houses where neighbors waved from their porches, a world away from this intimidating urban landscape. Inside the theater, the atmosphere was even more intense, with bright lights and cameras capturing every moment for national television. Contestants practiced scales, stretched, and nervously paced the hallways lined with posters of previous winners who had become household names. The energy was electric but overwhelming, filled with ambition and desperation that made Margaret question her decision to come. Margaret found a quiet corner near a water fountain and closed her eyes, thinking of Harold and the countless Sunday mornings they had shared in their little church on Maple Street. The production assistants, barely older than her own grandchildren, looked at her paperwork with confused expressions and double-checked her information twice. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" one asked kindly, his clipboard filled with names of much younger performers. Margaret nodded firmly, her resolve strengthening despite the doubtful stares and whispered comments surrounding her. She thought of Harold's words, "Don't let anyone dim your light, Maggie." When Margaret's name was called over the theater's sound system, she walked slowly across the vast stage, her sensible shoes echoing in the hushed auditorium like a steady heartbeat. The stage lights were brighter than anything she had ever experienced, making the audience beyond them appear as shadowy figures in an ocean of darkness. The 3 judges sat behind their imposing desk, their expressions ranging from curious to skeptical as they watched this unexpected contestant approach the microphone. The audience of fellow contestants watched from the shadows, many already smirking at what they expected would be an embarrassing performance worthy of social media mockery. "Well, this is unexpected," said the lead judge, a famous pop star known for his sharp critiques and brutal honesty with hopeful performers. His designer suit and perfectly styled hair seemed to emphasize the gulf between his world and Margaret's simple life. The cameras zoomed in on her weathered face, capturing every line and wrinkle that told the story of 7 decades of life experience. "What's your name? And what brings you here today?" Margaret stepped closer to the microphone, adjusting its height slightly, her voice steady despite her racing heart that felt like it might burst from her chest. The silence in the theater was deafening, broken only by the hum of electronic equipment and distant traffic outside. I'm Margaret Wilson from Cleveland, Ohio. I'm 72 years old, and I've been singing in my church choir for 50 years. The audience rippled with barely suppressed laughter, and she could see phones being raised to record what they assumed would be a viral moment of failure. Several contestants in the wings were already composing social media posts about the delusional grandmother who thought she could compete with real talent. "And what song will you be performing for us today?" asked the female judge, trying to maintain professionalism while clearly struggling not to smile at the unusual situation. Her perfectly applied makeup and expensive jewelry reminded Margaret of how out of place she truly was in this glamorous world. "Amazing Grace," Margaret replied simply, her voice carrying the same quiet dignity she brought to Sunday services. The judges exchanged glances, and several audience members rolled their eyes or shook their heads in disbelief. "Well, Margaret, the stage is yours," the lead judge said with obvious skepticism, settling back in his chair as if preparing for an uncomfortable few minutes. As Margaret positioned herself at the microphone, she could feel the weight of hundreds of judgmental eyes upon her, but also Harold's presence somehow encouraging her forward. The piano introduction began, and for a moment, she thought of turning around and walking away to save herself the humiliation that seemed inevitable. Then Margaret opened her mouth, and the first note that emerged silenced every whisper, every shuffle, every breath in the theater. Her voice, rich and powerful despite her age, filled every corner of the auditorium with a clarity and depth that seemed impossible from her small, unassuming frame. "An amazing grace. How sweet the sound. That saved a wretch like me." The mocking expressions on faces in the audience began to change, replaced by genuine surprise and growing amazement as her voice soared with professional quality. Her voice carried decades of experience, loss, love, and unwavering faith, each word delivered with an emotional depth that only a life fully lived could provide. The theater's acoustics seemed designed for her voice, amplifying not just the sound but the soul behind it. The judges leaned forward, their skepticism evaporating like morning mist as Margaret's voice demonstrated technical skill that rivaled trained professionals. In the audience, the young man who had mocked her earlier stood with his mouth open, his leather jacket suddenly seeming like a costume rather than armor. The teenage girls who had questioned her presence now had tears streaming down their faces, their own dreams suddenly feeling smaller in comparison to this woman's courage. Margaret closed her eyes and sang not for the cameras or the judges, but for Harold, for Jessica, for every Sunday morning and every life she had touched through music over the decades. She thought of the countless funerals where her voice had comforted grieving families, the weddings where she had celebrated new love, and the baptisms where she had welcomed new life. Her voice seemed to transcend the physical space, reaching into hearts and memories of everyone present, reminding them of their own grandmothers, their own faith, their own humanity. As she reached the final verse, her voice grew even stronger, filling the space with a power that seemed to lift everyone present above their petty judgments and into something transcendent. "Was blind, but now I see." The last note hung in the air like a prayer, reverberating through the theater's acoustics, and for several seconds that felt like an eternity, the theater remained in complete, reverent silence. Margaret opened her eyes to see tears on the lead judge's face, something that had never happened in the show's history. Even the camera operators had stopped their movements, transfixed by what they had just witnessed. Then the applause began like thunder rolling across the plains of her Ohio childhood. It started slowly with one person, then two, Then suddenly the entire auditorium erupted in thunderous clapping that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The judges were on their feet, their faces showing genuine amazement and newfound respect for this grandmother who had just redefined their understanding of talent. The lead judge, known for his harsh critiques and dismissive attitude, wiped away tears he didn't know he was capable of shedding. Margaret, in 20 years of doing this show, I have never, and I mean never, heard anything like that. You just taught us all about the true meaning of artistry. His voice cracked with emotion, a vulnerability he had never shown on television before. The contestants who had mocked her earlier now applauded enthusiastically, their expressions transformed from condescension to admiration and shame for their earlier behavior. The female judge spoke through her own tears, her voice breaking with emotion. You just reminded us all why music exists, why it matters, and why age is nothing but a number when it comes to sharing your soul. Margaret stood at the microphone, overwhelmed by the response, her own eyes glistening with tears of joy and relief that she had honored Harold's memory. The standing ovation continued for what felt like minutes, wave after wave of appreciation, washing over her like the warmth of Sunday morning sunlight through stained glass windows. Production crew members who had seen thousands of auditions stood transfixed, many wiping away their own tears at the unexpected beauty they had just witnessed. The sound engineer, a grizzled veteran of the music industry, removed his headphones and joined the applause, something he had never done in 30 years of recording performances. When she finally walked off stage, fellow contestants approached her with congratulations and heartfelt apologies for their earlier treatment. The young man who had been rude earlier took her hand gently, his tough facade completely dropped. Ma'am, I'm so sorry for what I said. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my life. Margaret smiled gracefully, patting his hand with the same gentleness she had shown her own grandchildren. Music has no age limit, dear. It lives in all of us. As she gathered her purse and prepared to return to her simple life in Cleveland, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the joy of sharing her true self with the world. Her voice had finally found its proper stage, and Harold's dream for her had come true. The drive home would be different than the nervous journey here. It would be a victory lap for a woman who had finally stepped into the light she was meant to shine. She knew that tomorrow she would return to her kitchen, her pies, and her quiet neighborhood. But she would never be the same woman who had left Cleveland just 2 days ago.